Well, welcome everyone, and I'm really pleased today to welcome Professor John Spoehr, the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research Impact and the Director of the Australian Industrial Transformation Institute at Flinders Uni. So welcome today, John, and real privilege to have you with us.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, John, and welcome everyone. Great to have you participating in today.
Just before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us meet today. For me, this is the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'll just kick off by asking John a couple of questions, but I'd encourage you to use the chat feature in Zoom. So if you just go down to the bottom of your screens, there's a chat area where you can type in questions, and John and I will be looking out for those, and we'll be able to respond to your questions as we progress through this discussion. Okay, but first let's commence. John, could you tell us a bit about your background and how you got into the field of industrial transformation?
Yeah, well, I've been working in academia for about over 25 years now, and before I was at Flinders University, I was at the University of Adelaide for about 20 plus years, and but I wasn't always in academia. I was actually working in community organisations, and I worked in the labour movement for a short period of time as well, at the United Trades and Labour Council, and I think, John, I might have met you there when I was involved in United Trades and Labour Council many years ago, and at that time I was sort of focusing on all the social wage issues, income support issues, employment, unemployment, social policy, public policy. And at that time, during the 1980s, of course, we were going through a really challenging time with the 1980s recession, and that very much sharpened my own thinking and understanding of the impact of economic downturns. The 80s recession, as many of you would remember, was a shocker, as was the 90s. So it seemed in those days that we were going to have recessions every 10 years, and that taught me a lot about economics, taught me a lot about politics, and my understanding of government responses, the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of them variously grew over that time. But it really sharpened my interest in establishing a research facility that was focused on understanding the consequences of these economic and social shocks, but also looking at how we can avoid them through different forms of economic systems and social systems. And more importantly, when you're not in a crisis, how can you build a fairer, more just and prosperous society? So the institute that I'm in now, which I set up about 3.5 years ago at Flinders University, brings together academics from a range of different disciplines, so from economics, from psychology, and I'm situated in a building which we might talk about a little more later, in a building that's full of science and engineers. So I've been a social scientist all my life, and one of the big challenges I have set myself, I suppose, is how we can work across disciplinary boundaries within academia, and how that might be translated more broadly in society, to develop more holistic policy responses. So the engineers and the scientists are not working in isolation from the social scientists, and likewise the social scientists can better understand the power of the technologies that our scientists and engineers are immersed in. So this is sort of cutting edge research and endeavour, if you like, and as it turns out, it's pretty important in the current context.
Certainly is, yes. I think it's all hands on deck in terms of disciplines and colleges.
Yeah.
And we will return to Tonsley if we get the opportunity. But you did say that you've lived and worked and studied through a number of economic shocks over the decades. How do you rate, or what comments do you have on government responses to the current crisis we find ourselves in?
Yeah, well, it's so much different to the the recessions of the 80s and the 90s and even the GFC. I mean, you know, for the obvious reason, and that is, of course, its cause has been COVID-19, a virus that's highly infectious and is sweeping the globe as we speak. And so that precipitated the introduction of measures to try and control the virus, which had very significant economic and social consequences, but in a very short period of time. So during the recessions of the past, generally the economic and social consequences unfolded much more slowly than the crisis we're going through at the moment. So it's really a matter of weeks and months that we've gone from an unemployment rate of 6% to probably double that, 12% here in South Australia. And economic growth has gone into reverse. So a very sharp shock in a very short period of time, which characterises this particular crisis from the previous crises. In terms of the government response, well, of course, they had to respond to it as a health crisis predominantly to start with, and they are continuing to do so largely. And that's shaped the response. There's been no hesitation really in terms of the appetite to spend on the measures that are necessary to support the economy during this time. I mean, with a few exceptions, I'll talk about them in a little while. But in terms of putting in place a range of different income support packages for businesses or for individual people impacted by the crisis, there have been a range of significant investments. We can talk about the quality of those, the qualitative nature of those in a little while, but by and large, you've seen a pattern of governments around the world that have been forced, if you like, to have to intervene in a way that some might argue goes against the grain for at least some governments who are not used to having to invest their way out of crises. So I say in an article in the Adelaide Review, which we might come to in a little while, we're all Keynesians now. And I say that because it's, you know, governments against their political proclivities have been forced to have to become very interventionist in relation to the health crisis. The question is, will they remain so interventionist in relation to dealing with the economic crisis and the jobs crisis that we're facing as a consequence of this? So at least in relation to the JobKeeper scheme, you probably all remember that there was a reluctance initially to introduce a JobKeeper type wage supplement scheme here in Australia, but eventually pressure was brought to bear. Both the employers, employer organisations and unions got together and they lobbied together the government to introduce the JobKeeper scheme. And that was a good thing. It was absolutely necessary to provide a safety net for workers and keep them attached to the workforce. Doubling of the job seeker payment was overdue, as we know. There was, I think, a consensus in Australia that it was too low, and it had been too low for too long, so doubling of it was important. The question we might ask ourselves will be, will it be retained in months to come? And we can talk a bit about that in a little while. So I think the big test now going forward is, having contained the virus, whether or not the political will is there to continue to invest in recovery. And because of the depth of this crisis, we're going to have to invest very substantially in recovery if we're not, or if we're going to prevent unemployment remaining a serious problem for 2, 3 to 4 years. In past crises, it takes 4 to 5 years to get over the shock, work your way through the shock and bring it 10, 11, 12, 13% unemployment rate down to 6 or 5%. Look, I think it's going to come down more sharply this time because of the cause of the crisis, which is very different to previous recessions. But nevertheless, I think a lot of businesses will come out of this and they may not restart for various different reasons.
So I was getting a sense from you that there wasn't much of a rule book of how to respond to the sheer the intensity of this experience, but you're suggesting that there may be some lessons from past crises on how to avoid this tail, this protracted unemployment tail.
Well, I think there are. I think there are lessons from the 1990s, but perhaps the most instructive lessons come from the response to the global financial crisis. It was really no accident that Australia came out of the GFC more quickly than other nations. And people probably remember the very substantial stimulus package at that time. Actually, by today's standards, it's tiny. In fact, the stimulus so far invested in managing COVID dwarfs the stimulus that was provided during the GFC. And that tells you a lot about the dimensions, the magnitude of the current crisis. But still, it's not enough. But what we do know is that the recovery was more rapid in Australia. Unemployment, this is post the GFC, unemployment came down more rapidly. But you must invest in a range of different measures to help grow the economy, help aid the recovery, assist people to make the transition into jobs that are quite likely to be different to the ones they had prior to the crisis. So I argue that there's a need for substantial additional investment in social and physical infrastructure to modernise South Australia and Australia's infrastructure, and to modernise our economy more broadly too. We're probably about 10 years behind other economies in terms of our digital transformation, our industrial transformation. So we've got a bit of catching up to do, and that requires a very activist, interventionist role by government going forward. The big leaders in that are internationally are nations like Germany and Denmark and so on, who are right at the forefront of modern, sophisticated industrial transformation that supports high living standards, knowledge-intensive employment and so on. I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but that's the sort of thing we need to be thinking about as we emerge from this recovery. We're not going to go back to exactly how things were before, but there's going to be a lot that's very similar to the way it was before. But there'll be some big changes, some big shifts in the way in which we work and the way and the structure of our economy, particularly to the extent that our international borders remain closed to tourism, to students, and so on. That's going to have a massive impact on many of our sectors, including my own sector, the university sector, over the next few years.
Yeah, so in terms of those specifics or I'm interested in some specifics about the industrial transformation. What would it look like in South Australia? What can we take from some of those other countries you referenced here and now?
Yeah, well, manufacturing as a percentage of gross domestic product in a lot of other countries is much higher than it is here in Australia and South Australia. We were once a proud manufacturing nation, and I think we've taken our eye off the manufacturing ball, and of course that shows now. And it shows really in terms of the failure of supply chains to be able to deliver personal protective equipment and ventilators and other equipment necessary to manage a crisis like this. So, we need to learn from the COVID-19 crisis what we need to put in place in terms of more secure, robust supply chains and manufacturing, but not just to provide the medical devices and equipment that's necessary, more broadly to actually build a stronger manufacturing base in Australia, because there's a saying that what we make is what we know, and what that suggests to us is that if we're going to build a robust knowledge-based economy, we need to be a more robust manufacturing economy. Those economies with larger manufacturing sectors tend to be able to maintain a much higher standard of living. And that's forgotten by a lot of policymakers, and I'm hoping that the current crisis reminds policymakers just how centrally important manufacturing is. But that's not the only sector that's important. There are many other sectors, and the university sector, of course, is fundamentally important to driving this process of knowledge-intensive industry development that I'm talking about. What does it look like? Well, you know, the modern workplace has already been transformed by digital technologies, but in manufacturing, it's been transformed by advanced manufacturing technologies, all sorts of things like 3D printing, photonics, and the use of various different virtual reality, visualization technologies, and so on. These things are called key enabling technologies, and they make a big difference to the robustness of your economy if you are able to ensure that their use is more diffuse, more widely diffuse within your economy. And we've got a long way to go in that respect. So it's fundamentally about modernisation, about being part of the so-called the new industrial revolution, or the fourth industrial revolution, as some call it. Whether or not we're in the fourth industrial revolution is debatable, but one thing's for sure, these technologies are transforming economies, and if you're not part of it, you're certainly going to be a victim of not being part of it going forward. So we should use this massive digital experiment we've had in our households and in our workplace over the last few weeks and the last month. I think we've all learned a lot about how to use this technology, the technology we're communicating on today, and other technologies as a consequence of the crisis. So I think it would be a terrific thing if we could take this big digital experiment and ensure that more Australians are able to make use of digital technologies. But I've got to say, I'm also looking forward to getting out of the house and doing face-to-face meetings, because this can sometimes be exhausting. Not this one, but running meetings on these systems and trying to get things done is not easy as well. We're all learning and probably improving, but it's not you wouldn't want it to be the norm, would you?
No, everybody likes to talk about new norms. I've heard about the concept of Zoom fatigue. So
Zoom fatigue, yeah.
I think it's something that's entering our language. I've got one question. Ian Pope's posed a question. Might some of our already identified vulnerabilities perhaps present some opportunities for the future?
Absolutely right, Ian. I think that is a very live discussion at the moment. So it's a great time to be engaging in debate about how we might make these vulnerabilities our strengths. So out of crisis, opportunity often comes, but it only comes, I think, if we are very, very active in articulating what those opportunities are and embolden governments to take the necessary steps to support the development of industries that respond to those vulnerabilities. I think we need to take a very close look at our supply chains for medical devices and in Australia and PPE, but also in other areas as well. One can imagine that if a crisis like this were protracted for years and years, all sorts of other vulnerabilities are going to emerge in relation to our supply chains, our dependence upon imports from other parts of the world when everyone else is demanding the same product. So it may not be PPE today or ventilators today. It might be a whole range of other things tomorrow, including access to various different forms of energy, chemicals, other imports into our supply chains that we're currently vulnerable at the moment because of the narrowness of the supply base, the vulnerability of the supply base. So I think we'll have to do what I call a sort of comprehensive risk mapping exercise in Australia and ensure that we don't have the same kind of vulnerabilities that we've got at the moment going forward. So a lot of work there for all of us, but government will really have to get behind that.
Yeah, great. There's another question here from Alan's posed a question. Do you see any value in a scheme whereby skilled retirees could volunteer their service to help businesses to develop? I think he's exploring some sort of mentoring type arrangement.
Yeah, oh look, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm a great fan of that type of arrangement where we're building capability off the back, building the capability of new generations off the back of experience. Experience works, as I recall, the name of a report that I was involved in some years ago, which was all about valuing mature age expertise. And so, Alan, you're absolutely right, to be encouraged. And I like the idea of reverse mentoring, actually, of older experienced people and younger people working together, because there's lots of things that can be exchanged between the generations. And I'm really excited by that idea. I'd love to see that to be something that government's got behind, or we as a community just get behind going forward, because there's lots that we can learn from. And there's a lot of benefit, not only economically, socially, from that, particularly in this environment of physical distancing. I don't know about you, but again, I think I'm going to come out of this really, well, I'm already hungry for social contact and different ways of interacting, and that'd be a great way of doing it.
Yes, yes. So tell us about Tonsley then, because we're getting into the area of collaboration. How does Tonsley work, and how could it be an incubator for some of the future that you're envisaging?
Yeah, well, people probably remember Tonsley as the former Mitsubishi automotive manufacturing plant, and it closed back in 2007, 2008. You probably remember there was the Lonsdale engine plant that Mitsubishi had in operation. That closed, and then the assembly plant at Lonsdale closed. It's a large, sprawling site, which the previous state government decided it wanted to turn into an innovation district. So rather than it turning into a sort of bulky goods site or a housing estate, the idea was that you would try and provide a transition from a mass manufacturing factory, in this case of automotive vehicles, to other forms of manufacturing, advanced manufacturing linked to medical devices and products, a place where small and medium-sized enterprises rub shoulders with startup companies, and also where there was a strong educational emphasis. And at the Tonsley site, you've got all of that, really. You've got dozens of companies of different sizes working in a range of different sectors, but principally sort of engineering, electronics, advanced manufacturing, but also in health and social services as well. At one end of the site, excuse me, at one end of the site, you've got the Tonsley TAFE, which if you haven't seen it, is an amazing facility. So it was the old stamping plant of Mitsubishi. They used to stamp out the bodies of the cars in the stamping plant, but now that's a magnificent vocational education and training facility for all the construction trades that work alongside each other. And at the other end of the site is the Flinders at Tonsley building. And so we've got engineering and computing science, and also the social sciences in this fantastic building. It's a beautiful building. And then between the TAFE and the Flinders building, there's this big sawtooth structure, which was the old main assembly building. So it's got a sawtooth roof on it. So there are lots of companies that are under the cover of it. And John, you'd be pleased to know that on the roof is one of the is a process unfolding for one of the largest solar arrays in South Australia on the main assembly building roof. So in amidst that innovation district, as we call it, is some pretty amazing work being undertaken, and I'm really excited that in our own backyard, that is, literally in our backyard, those of us who are living in the south of Adelaide, we have probably one of the world's most exciting innovation districts. We just have to scale it up. We've got to be even more ambitious about it. We've got Tonsley 1.0, now we need Tonsley 2.0, which is something that the nation can be proud of, and we can use as a bit of a springboard for the growth of the jobs and industries of the future. And certainly that's happening now, but it has to happen on a much more ambitious scale.
Fantastic. Now, I've actually got a couple more questions, and the time we've got remaining, let's see if we can get through these. Meg's got a question. The Australian Institute has suggested that economic recovery should consist of projects that are local, labour intensive and with lasting benefits. ACOS is promoting a social housing building plan. My question is, would building social housing in SA use local or mostly imported materials? So, yeah, I guess, you know, are these the right mix of policies?
Yeah. Well, look, construction or investment in construction has one of the highest economic multipliers of any sector. So in principle, it makes a lot of sense during a downturn to invest heavily in construction, domestic construction, as well as infrastructure projects. We'll come to them in a little while. But domestic construction tends to consume more locally produced goods and services, but also have a multiplier impact on the rest of the economy, which is beneficial in terms of flow-on jobs throughout the economy. So you're right on. You're on a very good thing there, Meg. And the question is, how might you maximise local content too in those housing projects? Well, we do have a much smarter procurement process in Australia than we used in South Australia than we used to have some years ago. So it's very much encouraging local inputs and local skills in projects. So it's very, very important that we don't rush ahead and do these things in the absence of the way in which we procure both the skills required and the inputs, the products, the wood and other inputs into the construction process, because that does have a big impact, obviously, on the flow-on impacts. If we import a few homes from China, well, no, obviously it's not going to be too beneficial. And look, there has historically been a lot of that sort of importation going on, and the danger is that it's not only not beneficial economically, but it's also risky from an OH&S and a building standards point of view. So remember the cladding debacle, and so we have to use safety standards procurement to drive local inputs. That's not to be xenophobic about the way in which we interact with the rest of the world. It's actually just to say that there are good reasons right now for building robust, strong supply chains and then using that to export to other nations.
Great, thank you. Robert's got a question. As we move into recovery, what else can we be trying to influence in our local areas to assist with economic recovery, reducing unemployment and building social capital?
Yeah, look, I think that it's important that we all identify how we can improve local amenity and what the infrastructure implications of that are. So the buildings and infrastructure that we have in place, a lot of it does sorely need upgrading. And so the modernisation of our infrastructure at the local level, to some extent, it's been a local government responsibility historically, and local government is probably going to be very constrained going forward, going to be reluctant to borrow to fund infrastructure projects, but the state and the federal government should not be shy of borrowing for the purpose of upgrading our infrastructure projects, even small projects or a bunch of small projects at the local level. So local government needs to work with state and federal government to come up with a list of projects that could be supported over the next 5 years. And if you've looked at interest rates lately, you know that interest rates for borrowing on public, for the purposes of public investment, is at absolute historic lows. So you're almost giving the money away. So you can lock in very low cost borrowings at the moment to achieve substantial benefit through investment in infrastructure projects. So I think feeding those ideas through to local government so that they can feed them through to state government. But one thing that came to mind immediately, which I'll just mention very quickly, that's important, I think, is of course the big challenge that sits in the background of all this, that of course that has faded to some extent as a consequence of the crisis, is how we tackle climate change going forward. And much of that, in my mind, requires local responses, adaptation, mitigation measures that we need to put in place, and this would be a good time to start to do that.
Yeah. Fantastic. Have we got time for 2 more questions, John?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, thank you, and I hope others happy. I think it was, I've even got a thumbs up from Robert. Thank you for that. Anne has a question, and there's a couple of words here, so I'll just read it all out. If we have smart strategies e.g. investment in infrastructure, can we avoid economic and social collapse with government borrowing, accumulating a sizable deficit debt, and not aim to repay it, i.e. stimulating consumption by borrowing? Or is a collapse inevitable, a deeper depression than the 1930s? Is that making sense? That is, can we basically print money as long as it's tied to productivity?
It's a really good question. It's the makings of a separate discussion in lots of ways, but I'll say this. At the moment, our debt as a percentage of GDP is relatively low, so by international standards. So we've got a long way to go before we're into dangerous territory. That's not to say that other nations might well be in dangerous territory. So we can sustain much more substantial borrowings than we currently have. It would have a significant economic benefit in that it would bring forward jobs growth, and it would accelerate recovery in key sectors so that they are then paying taxes to government that will sustain budgets over years to come. It's true that at the end of the day, governments have the capacity to print money. There are consequences for that if it's not thought through well, but history tells us that governments can do that and write off the debt. If necessary, they can write off the debt. So governments, unlike households, have this unique capacity to create credit. And that's not well understood in the community. That ability enables you to do things that households can't possibly do because your ability to be able to create credit through printing money and then, if necessary, write off some of that debt in order to be able to make the economic circumstances you're in sustainable over the medium term. There are limits to that. There are political limits to that. But it shouldn't be forgotten that is a tool that's available to government.
Thank you. And our last question, Raquel and Paul had a question, and also Meg had a comment about the better climate. What sort of plans appear to be in place to mitigate the ongoing exorbitant advance of the impact of climate change?
Well, I think it would be very smart for us to integrate an accelerated response to climate change into the recovery plans. So it's central to the recovery. So there is no shortage of good work, or of opportunities, economic opportunities associated with climate change mitigation and adaptation. Many millions of jobs globally could be created, and as a consequence of us tackling climate change head on. So we have to assert that case, as a community, that to government, that this is a fundamental challenge that shouldn't be in any way downplayed as a consequence of the crisis we've gone through. And there is a danger, there is a risk. I think that might be the case, that the environment might suffer as a consequence of some very pragmatic responses to economic and industry development during the recovery period, rather than thinking about how we might tackle climate change concomitantly with tackling the consequences of the crisis.
Fantastic. Thank you, John, for that. And I'll call this, bring this to a close now, but John did mention that today, hitting the streets or hitting your computer, the Adelaide Review features an article by John, so look out for that. And just thank you so much for your insights today. And we're so fortunate to have somebody with such insights and such experience in our local area at such a critical time. So thank you, John.
Well, thanks, John. It's been great to be with you today. And yeah, I'm very proud to live in this area. It's a beautiful part of the world.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Tom.